Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversations. How do we make sense of Sino-Indian relations? Are India and China on a collision course, or will they learn to coexist, notwithstanding their differences? One is a rising superpower and the other is a major Asian power with global impact. Let's take a step back. Is there a larger conceptual narrative underlying the India-China relationship? Or is it merely a relationship based on transactions, mutual distrust, and caught in the uncomfortable web of a security dilemma? I personally think there is a need to reconceptualize the Sino-Indian relations because concepts, framing, and definitions matter in how we see, understand, and interpret things. One of India's major complaints about China has been that China is invading, quote unquote, into its traditional sphere of influence. But then, is India's neighborhood only India's or also China's? Why not look at the region as a shared neighborhood between India and China, and look at the challenges and opportunities in the region as shared challenges and opportunities? More importantly, can the two sides potentially look for convergence of interests? For instance, when Modi and Xi met in Wuhan for the first informal summit last year, they decided to work together on a project in Afghanistan. This is an excellent step, and we need more of that. I hope that the series of informal summits between Modi and Xi will pave the way for more free and frank discussions between the two Asian giants in the days to come. Over the next few weeks, we will be organizing a series of conversations on China with leading experts in the field. Today's conversation is about the second informal summit between India and China in particular, and India-China relations in general. My guest today is Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Nirupama Rao is a retired 1973 batch Indian Foreign Service officer. She served as India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 2011. She was also India's ambassador to the United States, China, and was India's High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. Ms. Rao is currently working on a book about the diplomatic political relationship between India and China in the run-up to the 1962 conflict. We're of course looking forward to that book. Welcome to the National Security Conversation, Ambassador Rao.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Can I begin this interview with a question on what the informal summit is all about? How is this different from a formal summit, and what is it that an informal summit can achieve that a formal summit cannot achieve?
To my mind, I think a summit should be more informal than formal. Because a formal summit is predicated really on a huge paraphernalia that is associated with it, whether it's protocol, whether it's just to do with the issues involved, the kind of agenda that you craft. An informal summit gives the leaders, the two interlocutors, the main interlocutors, the freedom perhaps to range across a number of issues, to dwell on some in more detail, and with a degree of freedom and less inhibition than you would associate with formal summits, where you have to go through the whole agenda, where you have the delegations sitting together, where communiques are drafted as outcomes. So I think this is more al fresco in many ways. But then you think of the Western summits, and then you think of a summit between India and China. This is a civilizational construct that you can give to it. Both are, from the east of the world. They represent Asia. They represent Asian values, and so the entire tenor of communication, I would presume, would be a little different from what it would mean if two Western leaders were meeting.
But there's a problem with the informal summit, right? If it is a formal summit, if it is sort of structured and the bureaucracies are deeply involved, you know what the outcome is going to be, or there are substantive outcomes, and those outcomes can be measured and can be taken forward. But in informal summit, the two leaders speak, and we don't know what the two leaders spoke to each other. And if that is the highest level of contact that we have, is that going to achieve anything at the end of the day?
My own impression is that even if the two leaders are speaking together, speaking to each other, and the others are not present, a certain degree debriefing does take place after the meeting. So each leader will obviously tell his or her senior official level representatives generally as to what transpired, what were the main points. So there is definitely a recording, a chronicling of what happened.
Right.
So it's not just that everything vanishes into ether. They meet, and they go and they meet again and nobody knows what really has transpired. That never happens.
But in any case, summits cannot replace the regular business of diplomacy, as it were.
No, they cannot replace the regular business of diplomacy. It's most essential that an informal summit of this nature infuses a certain degree of dynamism and energy and direction, most importantly, to the context, to the issues that are involved, and to the negotiations that are ongoing.
What is your take on the outcomes of the Chennai Connect? We had the Wuhan summit last year, the Wuhan Spirit, and then we have Chennai Connect this year. You've been India's ambassador to China. What's your take of the achievements of these two summits last year and this year?
Well, the fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping were able to meet, and about 18 months after the Wuhan Spirit, is a good thing. I don't think we should have any quarrel with the fact that a summit took place. And in many senses, a summit was necessary because things have been a little rocky in the relationship in the last few months, perhaps not in such a near-death situation as it was in Doklam, and then you had the Wuhan summit, and perhaps not to that degree. But the fact is, numerous contradictions keep sort of rearing their head in this relationship. It's not just competition. It has a lot to do, for instance, with China's stand on Kashmir post August 5th and what direction that has taken. Because for all these years, many of these years after normalization of relations between India and China, China had tended to take the line that a problem like Jammu and Kashmir has to be solved and sorted out bilaterally between India and Pakistan, and that it was not in a sense hovering over this issue the way it is today. Hovering, I use the word hovering not only because it's talked about the UN resolutions, but the whole issue seems to now be tied in very closely into the China-Pakistan nexus.
Absolutely.
So that should be a cause for concern,
So
a continuing cause for concern.
Right. So on the one hand, you are seeing a lot of warmth and friendship between the two leaders, as it were. On the other hand, you're also seeing China upping the ante on the Kashmir question and getting closer to Pakistan. And you call that a contradiction. How do we sort of resolve that contradiction, at least conceptually? What do you make of that contradiction? What explains that?
Well, it has a lot to do with China's own aspirations to big power status and placing itself in the Indian Ocean context in the larger connectivity concept, where it's able to acquire places, if not bases, all over the region. And it has in a sense leveraged its relationship, its long-standing relationship with Pakistan, to do more of that, to essentially to work towards the fulfillment of some of these goals. So that becomes a contradiction for us, because although we are well aware that this relationship was extremely close and had a strategic component to it, the way it has come into the public space in the last couple of years definitely seems to suggest that China has in a sense moved away from taking an essentially non-involved approach to such issues as those that divide India and Pakistan, whether it's terror, whether it's Kashmir today. So what is this going to mean for the future is what we should ask ourselves.
Right.
And would a summit of this nature solve it, to answer
Right.
your question?
Sure.
I think summits are good. The fact that we have this continued communication at the topmost level. Now, President Xi, obviously, everybody knows, is the paramount leader in China today. And Mr. Modi, has this, he's been re-elected. He enjoys enormous support across the public space in India. So both these leaders coming together, the kind of impact that makes in terms of two large nations, both the largest in Asia, both leading in many sense this whole definition of an Asian identity or an Asia, 21st century for Asia concept.
Right.
I think it reverberates very well across the world.
Looking at Chinese behavior internationally, one gets the feeling that China looks at the international system in a very hierarchical sense of the term, as it were. Do you think China looks at India as a junior partner? How does China look at India? You were the Indian ambassador there. So
well, my own impression and my own takeaway is that China doesn't take India seriously enough. That is my view. I mean, in terms of what is the Chinese view of Indian democracy? Let's take that as one of the issues. Now, at the establishment level, the Chinese establishment level, I think the inclination and the emphasis is to suggest that, these are two countries, India and China, two civilizations that have taken two different political paths. And what has China got to show for it at the end of 70 years, and what has India got to show for it at the end of 70 years? And they take a very Sino-centric view about this, that, Chinese communism and rule, single party rule has brought all this good to the Chinese people. Contrast it with what you see in India. And so they have a very slanted, selective take on the Indian democratic experiment. But that's different at the level of the people, because today you go to the microblogging sites in China, go to Sina Weibo, and the kind of comments you're getting, they are much more nuanced, much more, I think, well informed, and less prone to taking the establishment line. I mean, they see the good and the bad in Indian democracy, but they also see the good and the bad in the Chinese system.
But this is an interesting point. You're saying that the Chinese leaders, the Chinese state does not take India very seriously.
They kind of underbalance. I think that's a term that was used by one of the American scholars recently. Kind of underbalance. If India is building up its military strength, or India's capabilities have increased in terms of its ability to secure our borders, for instance, or our presence in the Indian Ocean, the Chinese don't talk about India just like that, singularly. They talk about us, yes, when we are getting together in the Quad, or our relationship with the United States is improving. Then, of course, it tends to capture some attention.
But that's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, you're also looking at a very robust trading partnership between the two sides. So to that extent, do you think the Chinese statements about Kashmir and Pakistan, they are probably something that the Chinese have to engage in simply because of its relationship with the Pakistanis? Do you really think China is concerned about what is happening in Kashmir? Do you really think that China is desirous of pushing India to the wall on Kashmir or Article 370 or vis-a-vis Pakistan?
Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't think the Chinese always leave an escape valve in everything. So there is no situation where they close all the hatches. So what I mean to say is that even in this, they're keeping the road to communication and channel to dialogue with India open. It's not that they're shutting those doors and they're saying that we have thrown in our lot with this side of the dispute. That's not what is happening. But they're giving the Pakistanis some comfort, definitely, with the kind of the words they have to say on the post-Article 370 nullification situation. And they have, of course, assets now in Pakistan with the CPEC and with the kind of, strategic aims they want to see fulfilled with the building of this corridor and the development of access to the warm waters, as it were, to use a great game term. Yeah.
Ambassador, in fact, after the visit to India, Xi Jinping visited Nepal, and this was actually the first visit by a Chinese leader to Nepal in 23 years. And in Kathmandu, Xi said, China will always support Nepal in safeguarding its national independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Is that pointing fingers at India at some level? Or you don't think so?
Well, it's certainly diplomatic doublespeak, I would say. And you can to some extent read between the lines on that, because there's no prizes for guessing that there are sections of Nepalese opinion that have a certain view of Indian policies towards Nepal and what happened, post-earthquake and during the so-called blockade. So there are certain injured sentiments there in Nepal, just to put it very mildly. There are political interests that would certainly like to, see this issue played out between two giants such as India and China, with Nepal in between. But let us not forget, and I was just reading a thread from Amitav Ghosh the other day, the author, where he speaks about how Nepal has been this kind of window for the Chinese into South Asia. Historically, I'm talking of the Qing Empire days. when the great game was very much in progression, and when the British were ruling in the waves and everything else beyond, and the Qing were beginning to sort of develop a perspective on looking at British expansionism and how to safeguard Chinese interests. And Nepal was a key player in that. So it's not just now that the Chinese are looking at Nepal. I mean, we know the history of Sino-Nepalese relations from the early 1960s onwards, when they signed the border agreement, when they established diplomatic relations between the two countries. And India was so concerned at that time about it, if you read the archives. So this has been an ongoing matter. The Chinese presence and the Chinese expansion of influence in Nepal. And today, with the kind of economic heft, how it translates into influence for China, Nepal has become a playground for that.
Let me ask you a rather undiplomatic question. Did India push Nepal a bit too much around? Was there a blockade? The Chinese seem to be saying there was a blockade. The Nepalese seem to be saying there was a blockade. What's your take?
I don't know if I wouldn't use the term loosely. I mean, certainly India was not, proclaiming that there would be a blockade. There were, of course, elements in the Terai who were dissatisfied with the way the constitution had been framed, that were agitated and were able to create a situation which did not enable the normal transaction of business activity between the Indian side and the Nepalese side. Now, whether we were complicit or not in that, I mean, I can't say, because I don't belong to the government anymore and I'm not privy to those decisions. But I think in fact, with Atul Pokhrel, a colleague of mine in Brown University, we authored an article for The Hindu in 2015, I think it was, about the whole issue of India-Nepal relations. And we spoke about, Atul has been, much of his work has been in economics. And he, brought up this theory about when there are relations between two neighbors, even at the people-to-people level or at the level of countries, each one should think they're getting a fair deal from the other. Now the question I'm asking you is, does Nepal feel it hasn't got a fair deal from India?
I mean, I think the question
now,
would be...
there's a lot of psychological factors involved, a small country versus big country. And the fact that we are so intertwined, India and Nepal, so intertwined in so many ways. I mean, whether it's familial...
Could we have handled it better, the situation in 2015? Could we have handled it better?
I've always been an advocate of the fact that with our neighbors, our smaller neighbors, I mean, India is often perceived as a country that tends to want to have its way, and that perhaps we are not sensitive enough to our neighbors' concerns. Now, every person you speak to on the Indian side may deny that, but I've tried to detach myself a little from that, and I feel this concept of not just of equality, that fairness that the other smaller neighbor should feel has to be addressed. And if there are doubts and if there are questions or if there are suspicions, I think we should try our best to see that they are overcome.
And this is not just about Nepal, this is about every other small neighbor that we have. And I think that's probably, I mean, one could make the argument that's probably why China is able to
China wades into that. Not that China would take the medal for sensitivity or for concern. Not. I mean, our neighbors know that too. But I think, it makes for interesting, quote-unquote, diplomacy in our region.
That's right. Let's come to the boundary question, Ambassador Rao. This remains as one of the major challenges for India and China. Why have the two sides not been able to finalize a deal on the boundary question? I'm told people say that we know what to do, both sides know what to do, what give and take needs to be done. But why is that the two political leaders, and they are very strong political leaders at this point of time, Mr. Xi and Mr. Modi, why have they not been able to make a final deal on the boundary question?
Whatever be the case, I mean, if and when you have a solution to the boundary question, the settlement, it has to be a political level settlement, and it has to involve a degree of give and take between the two sides. And I think neither side is willing at this moment for that give and take. And it has nothing to do with just now. It has been like that probably from the beginning, except that there is an impression, there is a kind of a persistent view that maybe the Chinese were ready for a swap in the 1950s, when Premier Chou En-lai and Prime Minister Nehru had their confabulations. But when push comes to shove, we really don't know how the Chinese would have reacted, if we had really had to sign on the dotted line on a deal that involved that kind of quote unquote swap. We were not ready for it at that time. We were not prepared because, the whole build up of the public perception of what this boundary problem involved was centered very much at that time on the Aksai Chin area in Ladakh and the Chinese occupation, the Chinese aggression into that area. The eastern sector of the border, which is defined by the McMahon line, what is today Arunachal Pradesh, we knew, of course, that the Chinese had questions about the McMahon line, but the impression at that time was that they were somehow prepared to accept the realities there. They didn't want to disturb what had come about post, soon after independence, or liberation, what the status was. I think views were still being formed at that stage. But 30 years down the line, by 1985, the Chinese had made it very clear that the eastern sector, the Arunachal Pradesh sector, was the sector of the largest dispute, and that India would have to make concessions there if China was being asked to make concessions in the western sector. So, for the last 34 years, that's where it has stood.
So what was the nature of the conversations when you were the Foreign Secretary and before that when you were the Ambassador to China? Was there the broad contours of a deal that we could have worked out?
I really can't say, and I don't think it would be fair for me to say that a contours of the deal had. Many ideas have been floated, and this is a problem that has been discussed threadbare outside the government also. I think there numerous theories have been floated, but the point is that let's take India, a democracy, constitutionally defined limits, our maps are all in place. You can't really alter boundaries so easily. No government can do it, especially a democratically elected government. So when you're thinking of a border settlement, you must understand why it's taken so long is that it is so complicated and so complex. So the best way is to build confidence between the two sides to ensure that problems don't get out of hand. And that's how you have all the 6-7 confidence building agreements that have ensued since 1992-93. And that has kept the peace on the border, which I think is no mean achievement. But the lack of a boundary settlement certainly, I think, is there. It's at the heart of the relationship, it's at the core of the relationship. And we've tried to build structures around it. We've tried to sort of kind of quarantine it. But how long do we keep it in quarantine is the question.
Ambassador, where do you stand on the BRI, on the Belt and Road Initiative and on CPEC? There are people who are supporting this initiative both in India and in other places, and there are people who are critiquing these initiatives. Where do you stand?
Well, I see it as from the Indian perspective that while, as developing nations, all of us, I don't think anybody opposes connectivity. Now,
and we need more of that in South Asia.
We need more of that, and we don't have it today. Absolutely. I could speak for hours about the lack of connectivity. While South Asia is meant to be an integer, as Lakshman Kadirgamar said long ago, we're meant to be. And when do we get to that stage? But that's another production, as it were. But this production, the BRI, well, it is an expression, it's an index of growing Chinese power and influence. It's the way that they moved from the Deng Xiaoping lie low, take low profile to this we will be leaders. That's the President Xi line. He has completely reversed the Deng Xiaoping line. And this is really a sign, evidence of Chinese advance, as it were. And when I use the word advance, strategic advance, economic advance, perhaps at one stage it could translate into military advance also. Who knows? I mean, if a place like Hambantota, although the Sri Lankans would, deny vociferously that there's nothing military about it, but at some stage...
And that it was offered to India in the first place.
That's true. So positions change. No nation's position is static on any issue. That's something I've learned from 40 years in diplomacy. So tomorrow you don't know how China is going to use these assets it has created in the BRI. And with the decline and the, in a sense, a waning of American power in our region, China is really moving into that primus inter pares kind of situation. So this becomes, part of the assets. I hate to use the word ammunition, but in its control. So, and CPEC is a complicating factor for us because it goes through territory which we say belongs to us and which the Pakistanis now occupy. And where the Chinese, if you went by the China-Pakistan, so-called China-Pakistan Boundary Agreement of 1963, they gave the impression that everything would be settled really in due time and space once India and Pakistan had settled their problems on Kashmir. And that has been thrown out the window now because they have gone ahead and built the road. You recall 6-7 years ago when the World Bank wanted to do projects in Arunachal Pradesh. Who were the biggest protesters? The Chinese. So they can't turn round at us and preach about the need for India to.
So in other words, you're saying that once these assets are created in the region, the benign, so-called benign intentions could change, capabilities remain. So once these capabilities are there, in a future Chinese government may have a different intention altogether. And that's a challenge for us.
Yes, we all know from childhood that the dragon is a fire-breathing animal.
So should India have said that we do not want to be part of BRI, or should we have said that, all right, let's sit down and discuss this? What should India have said?
Well, that perhaps is an option, prepared to discuss. But the fact is, when the Chinese, I asked this question, counter question, did the Chinese do their political homework on the BRI? They did not do it. They could have consulted us.
That's true.
They could, if we had this strategic partnership for peace and prosperity, as it's called. Why didn't they consult us in the first place?
Let me ask you a rather conceptual question. What is the lens that we should use to understand and analyze Sino-Indian relations? Is it one of peaceful coexistence as the Panchsheel agreement would have it, or is it one of rivalry and mutual mistrust? This relationship to be very transactional at this point of time. We don't have as an academic, I don't have a conceptual sort of tool to analyze this. What would be your advice? How should we view it?
Well, I would put all the C's into it. Whether it's civilizational, whether it's coexistence, you call Panchsheel, I would put competition, and I would hope there will not be conflict. You know, they talk of the US and China, Graham Allison's analogy of the Thucydides trap and Athens and Sparta. Now, in the Asian context, who is Athens and who is Sparta? I would say China is Sparta and we are Athens.
That's an interesting concept. Although that's straight from the realist playbook, as it were. So you're looking at more competition and unease between the two sides rather than more cooperation.
I think so, and we will have to be on guard, definitely. But I think the structure that we developed in the relationship from 1988 after Rajiv Gandhi's visit. I know a lot of analysts say that it's fraying at the edges. That structure, may not really be relevant for what we are doing now. But if you look at the Modi years, now Mr. Modi comes to power in 2014, and he begins with friendship overtures to China. You had Xi Jinping come to Sabarmati, and then they met the next year again. Mr. Modi went to China. But then you see a gradual, build-up of tensions, whether it's on the Dalai Lama, whether it's on visits to Arunachal Pradesh, whether it's the NSG issue, whether it's, of course, the Masood Azhar thing persisted. So you had, and the impression that the rest of the world got was, here was an Indian government that had decided that they had to take a much more hard-nosed approach to China. And that went all the way, not that this was a planned, conclusion, up to Doklam. And then after Doklam, again you see the Wuhan spirit, and it seems that we in India have decided to dial down the tensions or dial down, what was seen as attempts to provoke China. We seem to have dialed it down. Are we going? Does this mean that the model in relations that was established post 1988, where we would talk about the boundary but build relations in other areas and maintain tensions at a lower key than before, persists?
after Wuhan, India made it a point to dial down the tensions. Is that going to be the template?
After Doklam, I would say.
After Doklam, and then the meeting, the summit took place in Wuhan. So there was a deliberate attempt on the Indian side to dial down tensions. Is that going to be the template of the future? That China will push us around and we will try and.
I don't know to what extent. I mean, if this the whole issue.
Here is an economy that is 5 times India's size. Here is a country that spends $250 billion on defense. We just spent $56 billion.
No, I agree. But I think it is in India's interest to engage China closely. And I don't think, we can talk very bravely about two fronts and how we can take on, everybody. But let's cut our coat according to our cloth for the moment. And we, as you rightly said, there's a lot more ground that we have to cover in order to, if at all, we catch up with China. I remember the days in the 80s when the Chinese sent delegations here to study our civil service, to study our audits, to study our space program. I mean, I remember those days, and they've moved so far ahead now.
It is famously said that India and China have not fired a bullet at each other for a very, very long time now, despite tensions and differences. What has made this possible? What happens between the two sides that takes care of the fact that there is no firing? Like India and Pakistan, we keep shooting at each other all the time. So what has made it possible?
I think the burden of history in some ways, what we learned from 1962. And also I think Indian leadership through successive administrations has shown that sense of having learnt from the past and made a genuine attempt to imbue this relationship with a sense of maturity. And by that I mean to open up the doors for dialogue with China, to be able to go like Rajiv Gandhi did all the way to Beijing, as it were. I think long ago it was, in one of the parliamentary debates, one of our prime ministers said, you cannot march to Peking. You cannot march to Peking. If you can't march to Peking, at least, make an attempt to engage them, to talk to them, and to see how you can dial down, as you said, tensions, and create a structure for this relationship that is predicated on more confidence building, reduction of tensions, engagement across the board, across all of government, as it were. But where I think we have to do a lot more work is for China to study India a little more seriously.
And take it a little more seriously.
India much more seriously than it.
Here is my final question, Ambassador Rao. Has India's political mishandling, and I use that word with a lot of caution here, in Jammu and Kashmir given China a chance and opening to push us around a bit? Or am I overstating the case?
As far as Article 370 was concerned, I've said this before also, it was something that was coming. I mean, the fact that the nullification was going to happen. And with this government, it had been a long-held article of faith. That whole article was an article of faith for them. They had to do away with it, and they had to, so that was something that we could have, we should have known was going to come. In the challenge really lies now in handling the international fallout of that decision. And we have to make sure that...
So there is an international fallout.
I think because people, at least the public opinion, and especially some of the more powerful sections of public opinion, people who mold opinion in the West mainly, are trying to go to town with all kinds of interpretations of what is happening in Kashmir today, post August 5th. So we have a huge challenge, may I say, and a big campaign to run on this issue in order to overcome this kind of these impressions that have been created. And countries like Pakistan, and of course China has given Pakistan support on this, are trying to make hay while the sun shines on this, literally.
But you would say that the August decision on Kashmir hasn't helped India's image or standing internationally?
I would say it has been a challenge for India. And has it internationalized the issue once again is the question. I think we have to consider that very seriously. Obviously, there has been the engendering, may I say, of a much wider much more intense international debate on the issue, which we had not seen in the last 20 to 30 years, despite all the troubles in Kashmir.
So, Ambassador Rao, do you think the Kashmir decision of August by the government of India has it helped India's image and standing in the international system, or has it damaged it? Or putting it differently, has it internationalized Kashmir once again, and unnecessarily so?
Really had anything much to say in opposition to the decision that has been taken, and most of our friends and partners, in fact, have essentially complied, let me say, with the decision taken by the government of India. So I don't think it has much to do with sovereign states opposing us and that becoming a big challenge for us. But there is a larger climate of opinion in this very interconnected digital age where so many opinions contend with each other. And the opinion that seems to be occupying the largest space is the fact that, what is going to happen to the Kashmiri people? They have been in quote unquote lockdown for more than 2 months now. What is the situation there? How are the people of the valley, for instance, faring post the decision? So that's where the challenge has occurred, and that's where you have, leading sections of international opinion in the media, especially the Western media, raising the issue and discussing it, analyzing it, and we haven't exactly been shown in a positive light in many of these analyses, as it were. And that's a challenge for us, because if that begins to gather more and more of a groundswell in terms of opinion, then we will be constantly having to explain ourselves. And that is where an internationalization aspect comes in. I remember in the early 90s when the insurgency and the militancy in Kashmir began, and I was serving in Washington at that. Kashmir was something we were constantly talking about, doing our briefs and improving upon them and bringing in speakers and having, to contend with all kinds of, especially Pakistani-led opinion in the US Congress. And so if that is going to be reenacted, I think that is going to be quite, I won't say it's difficult. We obviously will address it. We have the talent and we have the strength as a country to be able to say.
But this has made us more vulnerable.
But it makes us, yes, it makes us more exposed, let's say. We are exposed to this kind of criticism, and we have to explain ourselves. I never thought we should have to explain about a situation that is really internal to us. It's part of our domestic politics.
Ambassador, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.